Hello and welcome to another edition of The Magical World of G. Michael Vasey. And in this episode I speak with Gordon Strong, magician and author. Gordon was born near Glastonbury, Somerset, and currently lives in the west of England. He's an author and a speaker with an international following. His study of myths, metaphysics, and his hilarious fantasy novels displays endless research and cosmic imagination. I started by asking Gordon how he got started in magic in the first place.
Well, when I was a kid, I was definitely a sensitive lad, and that combined with where I was brought up, which was about 9 miles from Glastonbury. You could actually see Glastonbury Tor from the lawn of my mum and dad's house. And also, the other interesting thing is that there was a place called Bream Down, which is about a couple of miles away. And that is where Dion Fortune's novel, The Priestess, is set. And so that was always an interesting place for me. That always had some sort of vibration. And as well, the moors did, particularly out towards Glastonbury. Later on, I think what happened was, because my teenage years were in the 1960s and everything that was weird and wonderful seemed extremely attractive. And things like the tarot cards or Aleister Crowley or anything to do with the surreal. I'm trying not to use the word magic here because it's a specific word, but because I didn't really get into magic per se until the 1970s.
When you say sensitive kid, what do you mean by that? Did you see things, hear things?
Definitely. I'm sure that I could pick up on particularly the moods of people and vibrations of people and who I considered was attractive and who wasn't. And also just being, because I'm an only child, being on my own because it was by the sea, and just being on my own in that kind of environment where the landscape changed all the time because of the tides, and it all seemed like another world. Particularly with driftwood and things being washed up. So you were always in this changing world on my own. And I also had my grandfather's garden, and grandfather's place was hundreds of years old. So there was that whole vibration there, which definitely resonated with me.
Actually, I saw a video of you just yesterday. I was looking, and you'd posted a video, I think it was on Amazon probably, and you were talking about the tarot book, and you talked about the fact that years ago, getting hold of any tarot book was very difficult. So how did you overcome that problem?
Well, actually, getting a set of cards was the hard bit. There were only two. There was the Marseille and the Rider. But trying to find them, I was a student in Bristol in the 1960s. And so I knew one place where I thought I could get them. And I did end up, or somebody bought them for me, actually. And from that particular place. But it wasn't easy. I always describe it as, trying to buy pornography under the counter or something.
What a wonderful analogy. And how did you get into the magical side of things then? What was your pathway into magic?
Into the magic? Well, I think that came a bit later, really. Interestingly enough, not long after I'd got the tarot pack, I actually met two genuine magicians, and pretty heavy duty characters they were. They were both attached to the liberal Roman Catholic faith, and one was who was a kind of hermit, and he had a tarot pack, in fact, and I remember him doing my cards, which was quite profound at the time. And he had a chapel. He built a chapel, and that had quite a vibration to it. The other guy lived in in the city of Bristol. And he was very much more of a sort of flamboyant figure. And he held sort of gatherings every so often for those who were interested in the subject. But what always amazed me about him was that, I'm trying to think of his name, Morris is his name. And if you said anything in these meetings that was obvious or not well thought out, he came on down on you like a ton of bricks.
Right, old-fashioned sort of guy.
Oh, incredibly so. And he was very, very rigid in his thinking. You couldn't question some approach that he might have to the I Ching or something like that. That was it. You know, it was an absolute.
Yeah. And did you join any schools, or did you sort of hang around on the periphery of things? How did you sort of progress?
Well, I think I was pretty open-minded about talking to people who I considered had something to say. By that I mean we're talking now probably into the 80s, and there was already a bit of a scene in Glastonbury, and there were a few people who were worth talking to and worth learning from. There were also a lot of people who weren't worth talking to, but the people that knew were the old brigade. They weren't as much in the old brigade as Morris, but they were people like Gareth Knight or Alan Richardson, Harris. They were people who were knowledgeable and had books published, and they were schooled in in things. So it wasn't as if you were trying to discover what was worthwhile and what wasn't, because pretty well everything they'd said was.
Interesting. So where did you gain magical experience? What did you do? Ritual work? Did you that kind of thing?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I did some rituals with one or two other people in Glastonbury, which I wasn't terribly impressed with. There's a Druid faction, partly in Glastonbury and partly in a place called Stanton Drew, which I had a couple of books published on that subject. And the Druids would meet there. I won't say that was intense magic. It was more gatherings and going through the Druidic rituals. But that was a start of things. And then I thought I would prefer to do this on my own. And so I was very lucky because I had a place to do it. I had a temple in the house that I have. And so I could experiment. I could write rituals and perform them. Mm-hmm. But the really what attracted me was doing magic outside, because then you got the reaction of your environment, and that was that just built up again and again and again, particularly if you went to certain places that you'd made sacred for yourself. And then you would always get reaction from the weather or animals or plants or anything, And that struck me as being particularly powerful.
I think I probably understand. I've had a lot of sort of magical work give me meetings with squirrels and little blackbirds that talk to me, and crows that land on trees and start crowing at me as if I could understand, or butterflies landing on me en masse, like 3 or 4 of the things. So I think I understand exactly what you're talking about. And it is kind of powerful when it doesn't sound like very much to anybody listening in necessarily, but when it happens to you in that context, it certainly seems to be wow, something happened type territory, doesn't it?
Yes, very much so. And I think, and that's of course all very much part of the shamanic tradition,
yes,
which interests me greatly. And I, at certain points. Obviously, I read the Castaneda books and various other books. But I think what impressed me so much about that tradition was that it was solely to do with the landscape, you know, and the powers of the earth. And because I'd been brought up in the country, I could feel those powers already. And when, you know, you were invoking things, you could feel that vibration very easily.
I have to agree with you. I had a weird experience, prompted a couple of books on my side, but I had a weird experience over a year ago when I live in Brno, which is a city of about 300,000-400,000 people between Prague and Bratislava, or Prague and Vienna. It's in the Czech Republic. And I live just under the Spielberg Castle, which is on a hill and it has a park or parklands around it. And I was walking my daughter's dog one evening, and I disturbed a shaman at work. And it's almost comical because I'm walking the dog and I see this rucksack in the middle of this sort of area where you can take a seat and get a view of the city, you know. Yeah. And I'm thinking, oh boy, somebody must have left their rucksack. So I walk towards the rucksack, and as I get to the rucksack, I see the other side of it. What at first I thought was a skeleton laid out on the ground, and I'm, you know, a little bit perturbed by that. And I looked in the rucksack and realized that it was full of stones and little rocks and burns and sticks. And that's what this design, which I thought was a skeleton, was laid out on the ground. There was nobody around. So after a little bit of sniffing around, I thought, well, you know, I better not disturb whatever's going on. And I start walking, and this fella comes running towards me. I thought he was going to attack me. But he went right past me. And as he went past me, I realized he wasn't actually with it. He was singing to himself, and he was miles away. Right. And me and the dog kind of walked up and around onto street level so he could kind of spy down on what he was doing. And he was doing a little dance with a little drum by his ear and chanting. And I really wanted to find out who this guy was because I was intrigued. This is like Slavic shamanism. And over the next several months, he would leave these stone designs in plain view. And I would walk the dog or go for a walk on my own and sort of photograph them and check, because he would make minor changes. Some days he would leave little roll-up cigarette butts on the stones. Other days it would be a little bit of tobacco and this kind of thing. And this went on for quite some time, but I never managed to catch the guy again. So to this day, I still don't know who the shaman was, but it did trigger a great interest in Slavic shamanism. And it triggered a book I wrote called Chasing the Shaman, which, you know, was a joke on the fact that I was trying to find this guy, but never did. But it had such an impact on my life. Just, I almost got the idea, Gordon, that he knew I knew. Yeah. And he was playing two things. He was playing me, and he was doing whatever he was doing. Because I'm not joking. I would go, and he'd leave these little pebbles in areas, and I'd take my dowsing rods and try to see if there's any earth energy or any. And there wasn't. I couldn't figure out why he would leave these pebbles in certain places. And he would leave them there a few days, and then they would pop up in the design. So I thought, okay, fine. So I got myself a little pebble, and I put it next to his. And the next time I went, he'd moved my pebble about a foot away, so I moved it back. And we played this game, and my pebble ended up on his design. So he knew I knew. It was really interesting. I agree. I think, the shaman side of things is really intriguing and has certainly become a big component of what I'm doing over here.
What it's reminded me of course, is places that I've visited in the world where certain areas or certain, places would resonate to me. That happened particularly in America. I was in a place in Oregon, the Painted Hills, and that was absolutely extraordinary. And I was with somebody who wasn't particularly au fait with things. And I suddenly had this experience where I could feel the vibrations of the Native Americans who'd been there.
Right.
And it was so powerful that I fell on the ground crying. Okay. And then the next thing was that this door or portal or something opened up in the sky and this eagle flew out. I can remember that. And I was just so stunned. I mean, I couldn't verbalize what had happened to the person I was with. And there were several other things like that. I mean, I did rituals in the Midwest in America, in places where there were abandoned houses and just extraordinary, things you wouldn't find in England. But just I would latch on to some place and think, yes, that's the place to do a ritual. And somebody had contacted me from England asking me to do some healing for them. And I did this right there at this place. And when I'd finished, the sun came up, whoomp. And when I talked to her later, she said exactly the same thing that happened in England. The sun had risen at that particular moment. So it emphasizes the fact that, the geography doesn't matter. It's how you connect with wherever you are.
Yeah, and actually we're hitting into the whole area of everything. I mean, it's interesting because I live in the Czech Republic and I have lived here for 14 years, but I felt almost as if the country sucked the energy out of me. Mm-hmm. And I'd lived in, the US for 20 years prior to that and never experienced that kind of a feeling. I don't know whether it's the ex-communist past or something along those lines. A couple of friends of mine that I think Sue Vincent and Stuart, have suggested once or twice that perhaps I have a karmic, issue in the Czech Republic that Slavic lands that needs to be worked through. I remember asking Sue, what on earth can I do? Because this country is going to kill me and I can't leave it because I have a daughter that I want to be part of her life. And she said to me, well, connect with the land like we do in the UK. When you come over here, we go out to the landscape and we connect magically with the land. Why don't you do the same thing? Yeah. And do you know, Gordon, for all of my magical training and all of the stuff that I've done, I'd never thought about doing that. Can you believe that?
Yeah,
so I did. I did.
Yeah. Well, I mean, sometimes the most obvious answers, elude us, don't they?
Yeah. So I ended up really connecting, and now it's like completely different ball game. Yeah. I want to quickly go back to Stanton Drew. You'd mentioned it, and it was going to be my next question, whatever the conversation went. You've had a couple of books on Stanton Drew, and quite honestly, it's not a place I've ever been to or very familiar with. What's the connection for you, and how come you ended up writing a couple of books?
Well, I mean, I knew it existed, but I'd never sort of thought. I suppose I'd never thought very deeply about it. But it happened at a particular time when I wanted to write, but and I got in touch with a publisher in England, and I said, I think I wanted to write a book about the tarot, and he said, no, I don't want you to write a book about the tarot. I want you to write a book about Stanton Drew. And I said, oh, okay, yeah, I'll do that. And I didn't, in fact, publish the book with him. I published it with somebody else. But that was a huge, huge turning point in my life. It really was. Partly because it was the first book that I'd had published by a publisher. And that led on to another book, etc., etc. So there's a whole chain, and also me going to America. But I don't know. I mean, it was extraordinary because half the people, when I wrote the first book, half the people said to me, "Oh, it's wonderful that you've given some publicity to this place because it's so neglected." The other half said, "You've blown it. You let the cat out of the bag. Uh-huh. This is our special place." And I mean, I could see that in some ways. I mean, but what I found interesting was this. I mean, I can't even, recall so many things that happened, but they were uncanny, and somebody said to me, That's right. I said, this place has changed my life. I said, this has done so much for me. And he said, yes, but you've done so much for it. Meaning, he said, I'm sure that you helped build it, which something had never occurred to me before.
Indeed. The couple of times I've been involved with the Stone Circle in the UK, and we've done something or just acknowledged it, it has sprung to life. And for someone like myself, who is also sensitive, definitely feel it coming to life, but other people can as well, which is interesting. And I think these places are very powerful. So that Stanton Drew book was what, the first book you wrote, or one of the first books you wrote?
Yes, it was. And it was published by people called Wooden Books, and it was part of a series. I was never quite, I was jolly glad to get it out, but I was never quite happy with it in terms of its format. The second one is the better one, because I did it exactly as I wanted to, and the publisher took photographs and really got involved. I was so pleased that I did that, because I got everything out that I wanted to say about it in that book.
And where did you go from there in terms of writing?
Going back a bit, after the first book about Stanton Drew, another publisher approached me and wanted me to write a book about King Arthur.
Yeah.
And so I obviously agreed to do that. And from there, it was quite extraordinary, because an American publisher, through Alan Richardson, got in touch with me and said, we want you to write a book. And I said, well, what about? And they said, oh, Madame Blavatsky. And I said, oh, no, I don't want to write a book about Madame Blavatsky. Though I did later on. Interesting.
I've read that one.
Oh, right. Oh, great. But so I said, I want to write a book about Merlin. And they said, okay, do that. So I did. And that was like a huge seller in America, because this was like $1 billion publishers. That was a big change as well. And I'm glad I did that, obviously, because then I had the kind of reputation where I would be approached by publishers to write things. And that's how I came to write about Tarot and Madame Blavatsky and the Golden Dawn and all sorts of things.
Yes, and that seems to be how. Was that the book that took you to the US and got you? Because I know you have a connection with the US and you have a following there. Is that the one that really started that off?
Well, what happened? It was in fact an incident at Stanton Drew that took me to America. I didn't actually. I'd been to America. I'd been to the East Coast, but this guy approached me and said, "I want to be your agent." So I said, fine. And he said, well, come to San Francisco. He said, well, we'll do a tour from San Francisco right up to Seattle. And so I said, sounds good to me. And, got my ticket, and away we went. And from that point, I went back and forwards to the West Coast 2 or 3 times a year for ages.
And was the US thing more about the books, or was it, or were you also involved with the magical community there?
Well, the magical community was very different to what I was used to in England. I suppose that's pretty obvious, yes. But they tend to be very eclectic. The American esoteric scene. It's a bit of yoga here, a bit of this and that, but one of the things I did was tarot readings. I did tarot readings for years there, and that was a great experience, because obviously I met people through that, and that kind of gave me an insight into the American character as well. At the same time, I was doing lectures and workshops as well.
Yeah, I was living in Houston, not just north of Houston, in Texas, and I'd gotten to the Servants of the Light and was doing the first degree course via a very convoluted set of circumstances where I'd also been a member of the AMORC and then CR+C. But the Gary Stewart version, I got to know Gary Stewart a little bit in Dallas, because he lived in Dallas. But I really could not find anything that I would call substantial in that part of the US in terms of people to hang with, learn from. Like you say, it was very eclectic, tarot card readers, very new agey, a little bit shamanic stuff, but not really that deep. And very often kind of all congregated in some semi-Victorian town with a reputation for tourism. Yeah? So I couldn't find anything that really I could stick a stake in the ground and say, I want to do this. But Dolores Ashcroft-Mawicki used to come over and do their American tours. So I ended up getting to know Dolores quite well because I was a regular, weekend seminar visitor. And I remember talking to her about book publishing, and she told me, Gary, it's really not worth it. You don't sell many books. And of course, I've subsequently discovered the truth of that. What is your best-selling book, Merlin? The Merlin book?
Oh yes, definitely. I mean, that's because you had coast-to-coast publicity for it, and people would get in touch with me from all sorts of obscure places in America saying they bought the book, and that the problem with English publishers was that they would be very enthusiastic and they put out a great product, but they always expected you to do the promotion yourself.
Yeah.
Maybe that was the changing part of publishing. I don't know, but that's what I always ended up doing. And I never liked the idea of buying a stack of my own books and flogging them. That did not appeal to me at all, really, although I did it a couple of times.
I'd maybe get half a dozen copies, but nothing more than that. Yeah. Other than my first book, Inner Journeys, which was through Thoth in the UK, and he likes to pay me in books as opposed to actual cash, which I suppose works for both of us. Put out a huge amount of work, and up until quite recently, probably 4 or 5 years ago, I actually was following and buying quite a few of your works. I've read Line of Light, for example. I got the tarot book, and I think I even wrote a review on it. And one or two of your novels that you started to write in that period. And then, as you do, I wandered off in a slightly different direction. So I kind of lost the drift of where you were going. What have you been focused on recently, and why?
Well, that's interesting, because the last book I wrote specifically about magic was The Magical Character. I wrote 2 books. One was called The Way of Magic, which was a sort of introduction to magic. And then I wrote this one called The Magical Character. And I really wanted to write that one because it was aimed at anybody who wanted to take up doing ritual magic. And it wasn't so much warnings, but it was advice of how they should approach what they're doing. Because this would have been 2010. By that time, there were loads and loads of people saying they wanted to be magicians, or they were magicians or something. And I thought that this was a pretty, I won't say dangerous, but it was, I did find it quite alarming that people were getting involved in things that they didn't know what they were doing. And I mean, that's me being a bit extreme, but I mean, it's. I can always remember somebody. I was at giving a lecture, and somebody said, "How would you advise dabbling with magic?" And I said, "Don't." That's my advice on that one. I mean, it's the idea that you can. I don't know. You can. It's not play the fool exactly, but you can kind of pick it up and leave it, and then pick it up again, just as a kind of hobby. and that was the bit that I found not to my taste at all.
Yes, I can imagine. What kind of advice would you give somebody who was thinking about studying magic? Yeah.
I think it was attitude, making sure that you were absolutely knew what your motives were. That's the point, because I thought that anybody who was trying to do this for gain, whether it was to get, I don't know, riches or power over others, was understandable, because in the grimoires of the medieval times, that's all the agenda was, But I thought, if you're doing it for reasons like that, you want to be careful. Well, more than careful, because that's not what it's all about. And you won't progress, and you certainly won't engage with what magic is if you limit yourself to that kind of approach.
Yeah, and I think a good book that I would recommend to people under those circumstances would be go read Dion Fortune's self-defense book.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then you'll get an idea of the kind of things you can get yourself into.
And the other person I would recommend is W.G. Gray.
Yes.
Because I think Alan wrote a book, the Old Sod, which is his life. And if you read that, you definitely get an idea of what it's like to be a full-time magician, if you like. And also the experiences that he went through. I mean, I'll briefly one I can do. I think it's worth detailing. He was at Dunkirk, and all mayhem going on around him. And he was with his mate, and he said, "Have you still got that portable chess set?" And he said, "Yeah, I have." He said, "Well, let's have a game of chess." And so they had a game of chess, and he said, "At that moment, I realized that by totally concentrating on what I was doing, everything else was irrelevant. The fact that I might be killed any second or bombed or whatever." And he said that was a real turning point in my magical career.
I was I was on the other side of a podcast myself recently, and the guy was asking me what I was up to, and I started telling him that I was invoking various Slavic gods and goddesses, and what was happening. And of course, he interrupted and said, "I just want to remind the audience this is not something that an untrained magician should do." And I thought to myself, damn right, I should have said that, but I figured I was talking to an audience anyway that had some experience in it. But I think that a lot of commercialized stuff like The Secret, a lot of people really think The Secret. I mean, I've seen a couple of the movies, and they're nice. They're a bit tacky, and they're nice, and they do give some insight. But The Secret seems to me to be set up all about money and power and wealth and all that stuff, and it misses for me the know thyself bit, which is the whole point of doing magic, in my opinion. I've been trying to figure out who the hell I am for a long, long time, and I still have surprises at things I discover, and I probably will until the day I'm done, I suppose. I also wanted to ask you, on the writing side, you kind of went off in a fictional direction and wrote quite a lot of novels. What was behind that?
Well, people said to me, "Oh, you're bound to write a novel about wizards and knights and kings and things." And I said, "Oh, I don't know about that." But I did. I wrote one called Dawn of the Goddess. And that was published. And that was, quite popular. And I thought, I enjoyed doing that. But I thought, I can't possibly write another one. I can't build up a career as that kind of writer. So the next one I wrote was a spoof on that kind of genre. And I mean, that was published as well. And after that, I thought, well, I can write whatever I want. And I wrote 3 novels, sort of a trilogy about America, because I been there enough to get enough material. But I always brought in magical things, not too obviously, but there was always a hidden agenda there that things are not quite as they appear to be. And I've written loads of novels after that on all sorts of. I've written detective stories and all sorts. But if I could just briefly mention the other thing that happened with me, and this was very much a turning point again, is that I'd not so much neglected doing magic. I was still doing ritual magic, but I suddenly realized that magic was part of something. It could be part of something else. I mean, for instance, the ancient Greeks, studied metaphysics. I mean, what is metaphysics but the metaphysical magic? So that's why I got interested in philosophy and psychology. And as you know, Dion Fortune was a practicing psychologist. So that aspect of things really did interest me. And I put out 3 books on perception and reality. Again, bringing in magic, but trying to pitch it so that it would get to a wider audience.
I think you and I have probably gone off in similar directions at times, because I have a very strong interest in the quantum physics, the scientific, the sort of bleeding edge of science. I've gone off in a similar direction. I wrote a book called The New You, How to Create Your Own Reality, with like a cheap and cheerful version of The Secret, but with more emphasis on knowing yourself and doing the basics. It's sold a few, but you know how it is. So how do you find self-publishing as compared through Amazon compared to using a publisher? Any guidance for anybody you thinking about writing?
Well, it's pretty easy. I mean, all you do is upload your book and put a jolly cover to go with it. The only problem is that how do you publicize it? How do you promote it? I mean, you set your price and you see the royalty, and good luck to anybody who can sell 1,000 or something. I mean, I think it's a great boon, because it democratizes the whole business. And there is nothing worse, if you're a writer, than sending a manuscript to a publisher and they either don't reply or they say, well, we're not interested or something. I mean, I'll give you one little story. I sent a manuscript to somebody, and I can't remember the name of the publisher, but they put out fictional stuff, in the magical genre.
Yeah.
And they wrote back to me and they said, well, yes, it's extremely well written and gosh, you are really good, but there's not enough vampires in it. And that was that.
So what's next for Gordon Strong then?
What's next for Gordon Strong? Well, interestingly enough, I think I've come to a temporary halt with writing fiction, partly because I had an awful suspicion that I was writing the same thing again and again. And although I did enjoy writing these detective stories, but I'm working on an article at the moment, which is basically about the times we live in, the current situation, and how I see the difference between the way the world evolves naturally and how it can be manipulated with technology. Mm-hmm. And that's something that's been in the back of my head for some time, though I never actually wanted to write an article about that. But I mean, I've got the opportunity to do it, so I shall continue to do that. And that may prompt more work like that. I mean, I've never really wanted to comment, be a journalist, if you like, to comment on the situation, social or political or whatever. But I definitely felt moved to do it.
I will finish, I guess, by asking you, what about magic? Where are you with magic these days?
Still a believer. I certainly do a daily ritual, and I do rituals at full moon and new moon. I dress up less to do those.
Dress down more.
Dress down more. But the basics are there. And I think what's interesting is that you can find magic, I think particularly outside, in the countryside, where you want it. If you find a little corner that appeals to you, then cherish it. It doesn't have to be a stone circle. It can represent so much, and it's you having some kind of reciprocal energy with it. And that's what I would say to anybody who asks me that question.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right there, Gordon. And if people wanted to find out a bit more about you or buy your books, where would they go?
Well, I don't have a website anymore, I'm afraid. But just go on to Amazon and look at the books. There's enough of them.
So that's the end of another episode of The Magical World of G. Michael Vasey. My thanks to Gordon Strong for joining me. My thanks to you for listening. If you enjoyed this show, or indeed any of the previous episodes of the Magical World of G. Michael Vasey podcast, please do share it with your friends. Perhaps you would even consider following at the point of source where you listen to this podcast. That would be very helpful. This is G. Michael Vasey, and until next time, goodbye and stay safe. Bye.